Hey, folks. Thanks for coming by today. We've got somebody here from Providence, Rhode Island, North Carolina. I'm glad you're here today. Fairbury, Illinois, and again, another North Carolina, Arlington, Texas. Arlington, Texas is a great town. Charlotte, North Carolina, Winchester, Kentucky, Kansas City, Missouri. Waiting here, of course, for Facebook to come on. Lots of North Carolinians here, and I'm really glad to see that because North Carolina is one of my favorite states. And as soon as Facebook gets on here, which it is now, I'll tell you why. And I'm glad so many Facebook people are here from North Carolina. So, of course, my brother-in-law is from North Carolina. And as I've always said, that there are 4 states in the union that are always exceptions. Maine is one, Missouri is another, Texas is the third, and North Carolina is the fourth. Whenever I tell my students something is happening in the United States, I say it's happening that way everywhere except those 4 states. So I've gotten to know a lot about North Carolina history because of that. Someday I'll actually get to do state histories, and North Carolina will be one of the first. But we're here today in thanks to Kate Barr here. Kate Barr is a politician in North Carolina. You know her as the former North Carolina Senate candidate who ran as Kate Barr Can't Win as a protest against gerrymandering. And I found out about her in a car driving across North Carolina and thought, that is so cool. I need to know more. And it happened the person in the car with me knew her, so called her up. And we became friends after that. And she is now part of the Fair Map Fight Club and really struggling to get us away from gerrymandered maps. So when she thought it might be a good idea for us to do a piece today with Justice Anita Earls from North Carolina about voting and voter suppression, I jumped on it, both because voter suppression is connected to gerrymandering and because this is my big issue going into 2026 and 2028. We must fight back against voter suppression. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate, and she's going to introduce the justice, and we'll see where we go with this. I think it's going to be an interesting hour.
I am so excited to be here and see all of you, especially all my fellow North Carolinians. As Heather said, I'm your cruise director for this evening. I'm also the founder of the Can't Win Victory Fund, and we do a lot of work trying to basically right the wrongs on voter suppression and gerrymandering. That work is how I've actually gotten to know Heather and Justice Earls. The highlight of my 2024 campaign was when Heather tweeted something nice about me, and it is literally like framed over here. I don't know if you can see it. I also sent it to my mother. And then Justice Earls I've heard her described as a beacon of all of the state Supreme Courts across our country. And that is true for me. So the idea that I get to facilitate this conversation is just totally wild. For those of you that don't know Justice Earls, I want to tell you a little bit about what, Heather, are we allowed to swear on this channel?
I don't, but you're welcome to.
Okay, what a badass she is.
Is that a swear?
I hope not. I'm never sure. Okay, well, it's an accurate one. Justice Earls has been a fierce advocate for civil rights for her whole legal career. So she grew up in Seattle, Washington, after Missouri banned interracial marriage, and her parents, who were in an interracial marriage, had to move. She served in President Clinton's Department of Justice as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division. She was the director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. She founded the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. She's rumored to have been on President Biden's list for U.S. Supreme Court, although we will not ask her to confirm or deny that. She also happens to be a kind and delightful person who writes some of the most scathing, fierce dissents in the state Supreme Court decisions across the country. She's running for re-election in 2026, and holding her seat is a critical step towards North Carolina gaining fair maps. And all of that, Heather, you bring the American history context, all of your expertise on the civil rights movement to this conversation. And Justice Earls, you're bringing like decades of wisdom about fighting for voting rights and civil rights in our court system. And I can't wait to hear what you have to say. So to set the table, Heather, I'm hoping you can give us some context, historical context for what led up to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons I care so deeply about voting is because the promise of the Declaration of Independence was that everybody had a right to have a say in their government. And that was, of course, when it was drafted in 1776, really limited to white men and largely white men of property. But that idea that a democracy depends on people's ability to have a say in their government is absolutely vital to American democracy then and now. And what we had in the American South from about 1874 to 1964, I'm going to take you only to there, was a system under which Black Americans could not vote. And a number of white Americans as well could not vote under that system because there was essentially a one-party state entrenched in the southern states. And what happens is that after World War II, a number of presidents, both Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, recognized that this is not okay. That if the United States is really going to make a stand first against fascism, as it did during World War II, and then against communism, as it did after World War II, it must itself embrace democratic principles. So immediately after the war, there starts to be an attempt of lawmakers to look at old laws and say, well, you know, Black Americans should be able to vote because of these old laws that are on the books. We just need to strengthen them a little bit. So under Eisenhower, we get the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And the idea was that it would strengthen civil rights and voting rights enough that that would be enough, but it really wasn't. So in 64, we get under LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, a Democrat, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And inherent in that Civil Rights Act, we tend to forget this now because we got the Voting Rights Act the next year, was the idea that people would be able to vote, that Black Americans would be able to vote, which they weren't in the American South in that period and had historically not been able to vote. But what happened after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was that Black Americans started to try to vote. And interestingly, we don't hear a lot about this in our civil rights courses, but the people who were really organizing to enable Black Americans to vote in the American South was women, largely older women. And in Alabama, a woman named Amelia Boynton was organizing at the county level to get people to be able to vote. And she decided, this is 64, that the best way to call attention to her cause was to get Martin Luther King Jr., the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to be able to come to Selma, Alabama, where they were organizing to push the idea of voting rights. And this backstory is where we get what is going to become the Selma marches, because in Selma, people start to try to register to vote. And the sheriff, a guy named James Clark, basically says, not happening on my turf. And so he keeps arresting people. And a federal judge steps in and says, you got to stop arresting people. And so then he starts to use literacy tests. And in the literacy tests, no Black Americans can pass. Well, what happens then is that there are these marches in the area around Selma to try and enable Black Americans to vote. And a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson gets shot by police officers, and he runs actually and hides in a restaurant, and he dies in the kitchen of the restaurant. And there's such fury over the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson that the civil rights workers decide that they're going to try and leech some of that fury out of the Black community by putting together a march to Montgomery, Alabama from Selma to emphasize the need for voting rights. And this is where we get the march to Selma across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was named for a former KKK officer, Ku Klux Klan officer, in which people like John Lewis were attacked by police officers, and his skull was fractured. And Amelia Boynton is actually on that march, and she looks like she's been killed. At the time, of course, we now know who Representative Lewis was, but at the time, Amelia Boynton was the more famous of the two, and she is being held on the bridge like she's dead from being attacked. So after that, LBJ steps up and he says, we must make this cause the cause of American democracy. We must enable people to be able to vote. And the march continues from Selma to Montgomery, and they get to Montgomery on March 25th. And that night, a young white woman from Michigan is assassinated by the KKK as she is ferrying people away from the march. Her name was Viola Liuzza. And there is this sense that this is an American crusade to make sure that everybody can vote. And on August 6th, 1965, LBJ signs the Voting Rights Act. And I suspect the justice will be able to tell us what those pieces of the Voting Rights Act are that protected voting rights theoretically once and for all in the United States.
Yes, Justice Earls, please tell us what is in the Voting Rights Act, what was in the Voting Rights Act, and why was it so transformative?
Right. Well, I feel like we could spend actually hours on the history and what led up to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and including from a legal perspective, there were lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit pre-1965 trying to vindicate the rights of Black voters in the South who were trying to register to vote. And I think part of the genius of why the 65 Voting Rights Act was such a powerful piece of legislation is actually illustrated in that movie, Selma, because what you saw was people on the ground organizing in the South, having direct connection to and conversations with members of Congress about what they were facing and what it was going to take for them to be able to actually register and vote. And so the lawsuits after lawsuits happened because lawyers would challenge one version of the literacy test, saying this is unconstitutionally racially discriminatory. There were prior Voting Rights Acts. They were saying these violate those earlier Voting Rights Acts, and the jurisdiction would just change the test a little bit. And so then they'd have to file a new lawsuit over the new literacy test. So what they understood was that it wasn't enough to just be able to go to court to try to get rid of these disenfranchising techniques, and understand there had been lawsuits prior to 1965 filed against the literacy test in North Carolina and other places. So the two most powerful parts of the Voting Rights Act are Section 2, which applies to the entire country and says that you can't have any voting practice, procedure, method, custom. You can't have anything involving voting that results in the members of a minority group having less opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. Then Section 5, which applied only to 13 jurisdictions in whole or in part. So that was mostly places in the South. The coverage formula was based on, so whether or not your state was covered, and North Carolina was only partially covered. 60 counties in North Carolina were covered jurisdictions. And that was based on what percentage of the voters what percentage of Black voters were registered and had participated in the prior presidential election. And so it was a measure of how effective have these disenfranchising techniques been, and where in the country do we need to focus to eliminate them. And what Section 5 says is that you can't make a change affecting voting without getting either the Department of Justice or a local federal court to pre-clear it, to decide in advance that it does not have the purpose or the effect of discriminating against Black voters. So it was enormously powerful, not only as every change was supposed to be submitted to the Department of Justice. And we can talk a lot about how long it took for jurisdictions to actually comply with this law. It's stunning to me now how we kind of have pre-compliance is happening in our country, whereas with the Voting Rights Act, the law was passed. It took a long time for there to be compliance, but ultimately, between 1965 and 2006, when we lost Section 5, some 1,200 voting changes were stopped because of the Department of Justice saying, wait a minute, you can't do this. And that's everything from you can't move this polling place. You can't impose this dual registration system. You can't draw districts this way. Lots of different ways in which jurisdictions, you can't put in place a voter ID requirement that doesn't have a signature alternative. Lots of different laws that were objected to under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And so it did two things. Not only did you have to get pre-clearance before you could put the law into effect, it switched the burden of proof. So instead of plaintiffs, Black voters, having to go to the courts and say this law discriminates against us, the jurisdiction had the burden of proving that the law was not discriminatory. And that then led them to do things like consult with the leaders in Black community before they moved to polling place, so that they could report to the Justice Department. We have conferred, and locally leaders say this is not a problem. It brought transparency. So I started doing voting rights work in 1988, and every month I would get a list from the Department of Justice that told me every change across, I was working in North Carolina, every change across the state of North Carolina that had been submitted to the Justice Department. So I could get information about that change. You know, today there's much easier access than through the mail, but point being, you got a lot of information about what changes in voting were being contemplated. And of course, the thing we can't measure about Section 5, but we know happened, was the deterrent effect. So jurisdictions wouldn't pass a discriminatory law because they knew the Department of Justice wouldn't allow them. And you see things like when the day after the Shelby County decision, when the U.S. Supreme Court said that this process, this whole Section 5 process, is unconstitutional because the coverage formula was not updated when it was reauthorized. The day after, the North Carolina legislators said, well, now we can go with the full bill. In other words, they had in their back pocket measures that they knew would be discriminatory against Black voters, and they knew they couldn't pass them and put them into effect as long as Section 5 was there. And once Section 5 went away, they could go with the full bill. And so then it took years of litigation for plaintiffs to prove that a lot of what was in that bill was intentionally racially discriminatory, which plaintiffs ultimately did, resulting in the decision from the Fourth Circuit, which said that North Carolina had discriminated against Black voters with surgical precision. So the law was powerful because it gave anybody in the country the ability to sue if they thought their rights, if they thought their ability to vote was not equal to everyone else's. But it also put a burden on jurisdictions. Almost, I compared it at one point to environmental impact statements. You had to show what the impact was on Black voters and that it wouldn't harm them, wouldn't make them worse off. And, to my mind, this was also in the Shelby County decision where in Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg dissent, she said, throwing away this part of the Voting Rights Act was like throwing away your umbrella during a rainstorm because you're not getting wet when
So can you reiterate that? Because that's a really important piece, not the rain, but Shelby County v. Holder is a decision by the Supreme Court in 2013 that guts the Voting Rights Act by saying the pre-clearance that you just outlined was unconstitutional because it had not been updated since 1965, although it had been repeatedly reauthorized by Congress. Right. And as soon as that happened, like within 15 minutes, I believe, although that not necessarily in North Carolina, Republican-dominated states were already starting to change the rules under which people could vote. I have that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Because that's, we're talking about voting rights, and after 65, there was increasing Black and brown voting in America, and it seemed like voting was going to be stable in the country, and that has been chipped away at. Then we got Shelby County v. Holder, and then we got Brnovich. But maybe we don't want to get there yet, Kate, do we?
We can absolutely talk about Brnovich, but I'd also love to hear from both of you why these Republican states don't want a Voting Rights Act. Like, why don't we want people to vote without being impeded?
Well, let's throw that to the justice first, because I'm going to go real broad on this one.
Okay.
I think it's clear throughout this whole history we're talking about, the struggle to enfranchise minority voters across the country. And so I've been talking a lot about Black voters because in the North Carolina context, that is the largest minority group. We do have Native American voters whose rights have sometimes been vindicated through litigation. In Texas, definitely the rights of Hispanic voters Same with California. So it's any group that historically has been excluded. But you've seen two efforts, and this is true today as it was 50, 80 years ago, and that is keep people from getting a ballot, and if they do get a ballot, keep their ballot from counting equally. So that second level is the redistricting. But I could talk about Gamillion versus Lightfoot, a case out of Alabama in 1960, where the city of Tuskegee, and if you read the history of how this happened, more and more black folks, again after World War II, as we heard, came back from the war and said, I just fought for democracy abroad. It's time I get to vote in my own country. And so they started registering. And so the city of Tuskegee said, okay, you can register, but we're going to redraw the city boundaries so you're no longer voting in our city elections. And in that one instance, the U.S. Supreme Court said, wait a minute, that's a violation of the 14th Amendment. But these twin techniques of limiting access to the ballot and drawing districts in a way that suppresses the voting strength, I think that you can have a lot of debates about, is it race, is it politics, is it both, in terms of motivation. But I think the bottom line is it's anti-democratic.
And let me build on that, because we have in the United States a really weird confluence of the idea that if people vote, they are going to be able to affect the way tax dollars are spent. And from the beginning of the time that Black American men were allowed to vote, this idea that they would vote for policies that would cost tax dollars and therefore would require a redistribution of wealth from people with property to people without property became a central political piece. And there is a recognition on the part of people with property, a lot of property, that if voting is widespread, that in fact people will vote for things like Social Security and education and regulate business regulation and all sorts of policies that a very few people who are interested in consolidating power don't want. And I think what we see when we see voter suppression is absolutely the desire to consolidate power among a very small group. But inherent in that is a recognition that they do not have the popular majority. And this is one of the things I always say about states that are now described as, Republican states. The answer is more that they are voter suppression states. And I always say to people, you can tell when people are uncomfortable with the idea that they are in a minority when they start to take away voting rights. Because in Massachusetts, for example, which is a Democratic dominated state, they're not taking away drop boxes. They're actually trying to make more people eligible to vote. And the truth there is that they know that they have a pretty secure Democratic majority in Massachusetts. You look at a state like Texas that is taking away drop boxes, or Florida, same thing, throwing people off the rolls down there, regardless of what the voters have said. You look at these states that are taking away the opportunity to vote. That's a group of lawmakers who knows they cannot win in a free and fair election. And that's a really important piece, I think, in this moment where we're losing the right to vote. And there's these attempts across the country to cut away people from the vote. That is a recognition on the part of those lawmakers in those states, like Texas, for example, where they're in the middle of talking about a mid-decade redistricting, which is really, really unusual. That's they're basically saying, we don't think we can win in 2026, so let's just change the rules. And that, is just thoroughly anti-democratic. We need people to be able to pick their leaders rather than the leaders picking who gets to vote.
And Heather, you mentioned throwing people off the rolls. In North Carolina, we're facing that right now. There's a list of 103,000 people that are freshly partisan board of elections are threatening to throw off the rolls because they're missing, a driver's license number or a social security number. So North Carolinians that are listening, if you get that letter in the mail, that's real. You need to go fix something. Okay. Bring us up to present day, Justice Earls. We've covered. Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, just let me add to the point you just made. I would urge people to go to the State Board of Elections website and see if they or their family member's name is on that list, and to get their voter registrations updated. Because even though we were fortunate that a federal court said in Justice Riggs' case that you can't change the rules for voting after the election to change the result of the election, they said it's fine to change the rules before the next election. So that means for our municipal elections this year and our midterm elections in 2026, all of those voters who don't have that information will be, there's a very real possibility their votes won't count. So it is imperative that folks go and check. And so just go to the State Board of Elections website and check to see if you're on that list, and the instructions for how to update. They call it repair, but this is just another form of a literacy test in my view, because having a driver's license is actually not one of the constitutional requirements for being able to vote in this state. You have to be a citizen and be a resident and over the 18 years or older, and that's all that you should have to be able to establish. But at any rate, make sure that your registration is updated or repaired, and so that you can vote without the risk of it being thrown out.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's come to present day. We covered Shelby County v. Holder. Let's talk about Brnovich, Justice Earls. What is happening with the Voting Rights Act over, say, the last 4 or 5 years?
Well, the trend really goes back further than 4 or 5 years, but we talked about the Shelby County decision, which flat out eliminated Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And if I can just say a word about people who think that conservatives are not judicial activists, let me just tell you that Congress engaged in a huge effort, especially the House, to marshal an incredible factual record about when they were passing the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, which they said we still need Section 5. They examined the voting experience in all of the covered jurisdictions and said, and looked at, do we have equal opportunity for all voters in that jurisdiction, or do Black voters still, and in some places Hispanic voters, do they still face barriers? And an incredible record, thousands and thousands of pages of documentation that, yes, in 2006, when the law was reauthorized, there were incredible challenges, present day challenges to people being able to vote. And so the real question that the Supreme Court essentially said to Congress was, well, we don't care about all this legislative record, all these congressional hearings you had, all this evidence you looked at. We're going to say that just because you didn't extend it to the entire country, you didn't make the entire country covered, there's some kind of constitutional violation in that. And so, and in the past, the legal doctrine has always said, well, Congress can solve only part of a problem if they want to. They don't have to solve. It's not unconstitutional to solve just part of a problem, or that's been the jurisprudence. So the court essentially ignored and overrode everything that Congress had done when it threw out Section 5. In Brnovich, and I really think anyone who's interested, it's definitely worth looking at the dissenting opinion in that case, because Justice Sotomayor does an incredible job of laying out the history that we've just given about why the Voting Rights Act was passed in the first place. But that decision essentially guts Section 2, the first part I talked about, the part that applies to the entire country, and the dissenting opinion lays out why that Section 2 is needed, and why what the court, what in her view, what the majority of the court did was so wrong. And how did they gut Section 2? Up until that point, the Supreme Court had said, here's the criteria for deciding whether redistricting plans violate the Voting Rights Act. But they hadn't really laid out how other types of measures, like limiting early voting or cutting back on polling places, or these other types of changes, they hadn't really explained how you prove whether or not those violate the Voting Rights Act. And so the court said, okay, it's our turn now. We're going to talk about how you prove a Section 2 violation. And part of what's so powerful about Section 2 is that you don't have to prove discriminatory intent. You only have to prove discriminatory effect. And so the court said, well, if you're only going to have to prove effect, we're going to limit it in all these different ways. And so in purporting to create a standard for how you prove a violation, they actually said, well, you can't prove a violation if this happens, and you can't prove a violation if that happens. And so essentially narrowed the ability to challenge all other types of changes to the elections process by putting all these constraints in place.
So what Brnovich said, and Brnovich is 2021, right? Mm-hmm. What Brnovich said, if I'm correct, is that the new rules that Arizona put into place that did in fact discriminate against certain groups of people were okay, because you didn't have to have equal access to voting for it not to run afoul of the Voting Rights Act. Is that correct? Brnovich is hard not only because there are no vowels in the beginning of the man's name, but also there really aren't. It's BRNV or something.
Well, I think what they said was, we can tolerate a little bit of differences. We're going to impose this totality of the circumstances, and we're going to say, in the totality of the circumstances, there's all these ways you can vote, and so these limitations are okay.
Even if they discriminate against one group more than another group.
Right.
I feel like a little bit speechless hearing that, because it makes the rageful part of my brain kick in. However, I'm going to set that aside. So, Heather, we've seen essentially an erosion in Voting Rights Act and an erosion in access to voting. We've seen increased voter disenfranchisement, decreased access to voting. So talk to me about that through our civic lens today. In 65, it took collective action and judicial action through a lot of lawyers and cases. What do we need today?
Well, so the difference between now and 65, there's a bunch of differences that are really interesting. So one of the things in the United States that we think about when we think about expanding access to democracy is that often happens, not always, but it often happens when the economy is good. That is, people are like, I can feed my kids. I got a decent job. I got a car in the garage. I'm cool with somebody else having a shot at that as well. And you can see that happening in 65. That was a big part of the post-World War II push and the affluent society, as we called it. But there's something different going on now. And that's that this voter suppression that we have seen really since 1998, it began in Florida in 1998, and then took off in 1994 after the Democrats passed what is known as the Motor Voter Act of 1993. You started to see Republicans insisting that they lost elections only because of what they called voter fraud. And I think the justice would probably back me up with the argument that voter fraud, that is an individual cheating in order to vote, is actually really, really rare. Election fraud, where you mess with the system so that you grab an election that you would not have in a free and fair election, is far more common in the United States. So one of the things that we've seen since 1994, when a number of cases came up where, again, Republicans insisted they had lost only because of illegitimate voting, which they actually blamed on immigrants at the time, that idea has enabled the radical right. And my big thing is these are not real Republicans. This is a radical cabal that has taken over the Republican Party, has enabled them to put into place a series of policies that people hate. I mean, we've moved more than $50 trillion from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 1% of Americans between 1981 and 2021. People don't like that. We offshored our manufacturing. We've cut our education. We've cut, we tried to expand healthcare. Now we're cutting it back. There's there's all these policies that are in place, not because Americans as a whole like them and voted for them, but because the system now, between voter suppression and gerrymandering and the flooding of money into our system, has so skewed our democracy that it really is not representative any longer of the rest of us. So if you think about how we get this back, part of it is recognizing that this is not something that nobody should pay attention to because it's something happening in a back room and we don't really care. But this is really about our government doing what we want our government to do. And we have to find ways to make it responsive to us again. And one of the first ones right there is fighting back against voter suppression and gerrymandering, and doing it in part by making sure you are registered, but in part by supporting those organizations that are fighting back against voter suppression and gerrymandering and trying to get rid of Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that let money flow into our system. But also by speaking up about this and saying how important it is to our democracy, because the truth is that desire for equal access to voting cuts across partisan lines. And that's something we really need to lean into, I think, going forward.
Yeah, I will echo that. I, on the campaign trail, would talk to the farthest right MAGA person about gerrymandering, and we would end in a place where we were in agreement that it was wrong and there was a handshake. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Justice Earls, what are a couple of the key threats to our voting rights today, and what can we do about them?
I think that they're not all that different than what they've been in the past in terms of efforts to keep people from being registered or being able to cast a ballot, and then how our districts are drawn in gerrymandering. And on the efforts to keep people from being able to cast a ballot, I think voter ID in North Carolina continues to be a problem. And it's interesting because talking with voting rights advocates in Mississippi, for example, or Louisiana, they have a voter ID requirement, but it is not a barrier. In Louisiana, if you don't have an ID, you sign your name and you vote. In North Carolina, prior to the voter ID requirement, people without an ID, or no one showed an ID, we all signed our names and voted. And it is absolutely true that there are not documented cases of it. The only thing voter ID stops is impersonation fraud. And it is not rampant. People don't show up saying I'm somebody else and trying to vote. It's just not happening. So what voter ID really is a hurdle you have to jump through. And maybe it's only 5%. Sure, most of us drive, we have a driver's license, we can show our ID. But there are populations that don't have an ID. And
urban dwellers, the elderly, differently abled people, lots of people actually don't have a driver's license in any case.
Right. Unhoused populations who I firmly believe ought to be able to vote. People in nursing homes, a lot of different folks who don't have an ID. But I think there's widespread support for the concept, because most people think, oh yeah, of course we all have. You need an ID to pick up your prescriptions, or to open a bank account. So we all must have one. And you just got to remember, actually, there's people who don't go and pick up prescriptions or open bank accounts. But so that's one. But I think even more insidious are these, what I would call tinkering with election administration. And so that is exactly what we saw in North Carolina, where this notion that your ballot should be thrown out if you don't have your driver's license number or the last four of your social. And I just want to say that I honestly believe that it was the fact that so many voters who were on the Griffin list came forward and were willing to publicly say, I'm a doctor, or I'm a student. I've been voting all this time with no problem, and all of a sudden you're going to throw my ballot out because you think it could be fraudulent. I did not see one editorial anywhere in North Carolina supporting the Jefferson Griffin's effort to throw out all those ballots, and so my point is. We are now going to see a lot of technicalities. When you register to vote, has your registration been confirmed by you returning a postcard once it's sent to you? Like, all these hurdles, put more and more hurdles in front of the ability to vote, so that people will get discouraged. This is all about as much about discouraging folks, and when people think that they may be, questioned if they show up and try to vote, or they've got to take all these different steps just to get a ballot, they're not going to try it. And understand that this doesn't happen across the country. There are states that mail your ballot to you, right? There are other places that are making it easier to vote, because that's what we ought to do in a democracy. So it's not happening everywhere, but where it is happening, I do think it's vitally important that people stay on top of what's going on. You can be monitoring your local board of elections. Just think the power that you can have if you and 3 of your friends show up at the local board of elections meeting, which these are public bodies, public meetings, and ask questions about what they're doing. Following up with them to see if they're correcting all their voter registration forms. There's a lot that can be done right now. The potential is that there will be legislation making it harder to register, and that groups that are doing, in North Carolina, legislation that would make it illegal for nonpartisan, nonprofit groups to do voter registration. So we may see between now and the midterms, federal or state laws that make it harder to register, all in the name of preventing fraud, for which there is actually no evidence. But people being vigilant and understanding that they have to take action to protect the right to vote, I believe really makes a difference.
And just a reminder that whenever a political group tells you that they need to cut people away from voting for voter fraud or something, that says they are putting in neon lights that they know they do not have a majority of what people want, and they're trying to stop you from voting. That, I think, is an important point. I wonder, Kate, if we have enough time for you quickly to tell people who weren't following it what the fight was in North Carolina between the Jefferson campaign and the Griffin campaign.
Absolutely.
So you know a little bit about it?
Yes. So Justice Allison Riggs, who is Justice Earls' compatriot on our state Supreme Court, they are our only 2 Democratic justices on a 7-member court. She was up for election, and she won by 734 votes. And that is just how purple North Carolina is. We are like as purple gets. And Jefferson Griffin, made all of the appropriate kinds of challenges for recounts and hand recounts, and Justice Riggs' victory was confirmed. Then he went a little bit off the normal path when one loses an election and it's confirmed 3 times. And basically, the Republicans tried a new strategy for throwing out votes after an election. And they basically looked at folks that had voted. And if you had submitted your voter registration and it didn't have a particular number on it, or in some cases, if you had 4 names, I am a person who has 4 names. If you had 4 names, then they might have challenged the validity of your vote. Ultimately, there were about 68,000 votes that were challenged between the overseas ballots, where the system doesn't have a way for you to submit ID. We should talk about military folks as people who aren't necessarily able to show ID to vote because they are not supposed to take photographs of their military IDs, and you don't really serve overseas with your driver's license in your pocket. Ultimately, it took 6 months, a lot of court work in both the state level and the federal level, for Jefferson Griffin to finally concede that he had indeed lost that election. And honestly, it was inspirational for me to watch essentially our entire state come together and say, no, we count votes in this state. We count the votes that were cast, and that is the result we get. We saw Republican groups take out advertisements against what Griffin was doing. We saw, celebrities start sharing it, and things would go fully around the world when it was time to try to get our overseas voters to know what was going on. And I mean, part of the fear is that Justice Earls will face exactly the same thing in 2026, because that race is likely to be quite close. It is my dream that she will win by more than 10,000 votes and we won't have to deal with any of this nonsense. But that's kind of the picture of how at least North Carolina Republicans are handling elections.
Well, in North Carolina, yes, but this idea that a Democrat can't legitimately win an election and therefore something must have gone hinky in the voting is one that is taking hold across the country. And, it's incredibly anti-democratic, and all of us who care about democracy should really stand against it. Because the whole point of democracy is that you lose elections as well as win elections. And we're developing a group of people who don't think they can lose.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, we've seen some other states try this post-electoral challenge as well. Go ahead. Please go ahead, Justice Earls. You should.
Well, I just want to say a couple of things. So understand that 4 years earlier, our Chief Justice, Sherry Beasley, the first African-American woman to be Chief Justice of our Supreme Court, lost by 401 votes. And she did not, she had the recounts, and when the recounts were finished, she conceded. She did not try to toss out ballots. Secondly, Justice Riggs won by 734 because advocates across the state cured ballots, more than 1,000 ballots, I think. And so that happened after the election. There was a 7-day period that they could. So by curing ballots, I mean people who had to cast a provisional ballot because maybe they didn't have that ID and they needed to come back and show their ID, or there was some other problem with their ballot. And so in my view, like this army, small but committed group of individuals, private citizens who volunteered their time to call these voters, to follow up with them, to drive them to the Board of Elections if they needed to get those votes to be able to count, is the reason why Justice Riggs won. So understand that. It was really an incredible effort. But the other thing I want to mention in terms of what might happen nationally or in other places as well going forward is this effort. I was struggling to understand, why do they care about the last four of social or driver's license? And then I read about these master lists that are being compiled, citizen lists. And I think there's going to be an effort from at the national level to require matching, right? To require states to match their voter registration rolls to these citizen roles, and then knock off people who don't match. And that is exactly what caused all the problems in Florida in 2000. Remember Bush v. Gore?
That was my first election. What a terrible way to start.
Right. And so I represented the NAACP in Florida, who sued all these Black folks who'd been voting for years, showed up and were told, well, you're not on the rolls anymore. And what had happened was their name was matched to someone who had a felony conviction or someone who died, but mostly it was convictions. And so they knocked a lot of people off the rolls who were in fact legitimate voters. And so I'm very concerned about database matching and what could happen to voter registration rolls across the country if that move goes forward.
Yeah. And as I recall, the reports of that election in Florida were that in 1998, when that law went through, and then the rolls were affected going forward for the next 2 years, that as many as 100,000 voters, primarily Black voters, were knocked off the Florida rolls. And, every time we think about that election, we think about the hanging chads and the few hundred votes that made a difference between the Democratic candidate Al Gore and the Republican candidate George W. Bush. But man, you yank 100,000 people off the rolls before that election, it's a done deal.
Yeah. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I have two questions that I very much would like to hear your answers to. So first, if you could wave a magic wand, what would a Voting Rights Act of today look like? What would it include? What would we fix? What would we promote? Justice Earls, you want to go first?
Oh, okay. What I'll say is that we know what to do. There have been bill after bill. There's been bill after bill introduced in Congress. Again, this year, March of 2025, John Lewis Voting Rights Act. They've done different things, various things. And there are also state Voting Rights Act. So if you're looking for models, I would look to New York State, California, Illinois, Washington, they all have state voting rights acts, and those are actually targeted at getting fair districts. Some of the federal provisions would open the door to encouraging creating redistricting commissions rather than having legislators draw their own districts. Measures that there's some folks who think more broadly about should we have a constitutional amendment to federalize a right to vote. But I think that the short answer is there's no lack of understanding or knowledge about what the laws need to look like. The real question is, how do we create the political will to get that done? And so I think there's I'm kind of skipping ahead to not only what do we want to do, but how do we do it?
Yeah.
And I think a huge part of how we do it has to be an inside and an outside strategy. So working within the system, using litigation, even I think when you lose, you illustrate what the barriers are, right? That's how they got to 1965, was case after case after case showing we're trying to open up the process and here are the barriers. So that's an inside the system strategy, but also people standing up and saying, yes, I care about democracy. Sometimes you hear, oh, folks don't really care about these democracy issues. I think that's not true. I think they really do. And so letting your voice be heard, that you will not, that you want an electoral process that is fair and open and that makes it easy for everyone to cast a ballot is really, really important.
Heather, what about you?
Well, and again, people saying when they've been tossed off rolls, that helps for people to understand that, or why they're having trouble voting. That helps for people to understand that it really is happening and that a lot of voices aren't being heard here. So I actually quite like some of the measures that were in front of Congress during the Biden administration, and now things like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is named, of course, for the man whose skull was cracked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, who's died about 5 years ago, Representative John Lewis. But the pieces seem really on their face easy. We have to make sure people can vote. And one of the ways you can do that is to make it a requirement to vote, which I was always against, because I'm like, you're not telling me what to do, even though I do vote. But somebody pointed out that switches the burden to the state to make it easy to vote, as opposed to what it is now, which is trying to make it hard to vote. So that's an option, but certainly protecting the right to vote, ending gerrymandering. That's my big thing. Gerrymandering makes me bonkers. I'm sure, Kate, you wouldn't understand that. And
I don't care about it at all.
And getting big money out of politics. And the reason that those are my three top pieces are because we know that those are enormously popular across the country, no matter what your political persuasion is. The problem is that people who were elected under voter suppression, gerrymandering, and money in politics don't want to change that system. So getting those things fixed would be a start, and then we can take on the larger things. The Electoral College is desperately broken and has been broken since Thomas Jefferson broke it in 1800. Don't start me. And figuring out how to make sure that the election of our presidents reflects the popular will as well. It's not just about partisanship. It's about protecting democracy, because if you create a system in which an opposition does not believe it has a realistic chance of getting control of the government, even for small periods of time, first of all, you've lost your democracy. But second of all, you've created a huge group of people who doesn't believe in the system any longer. And, I'm not going to make bad predictions here, but at the very least, you're inviting a dramatically destabilized society and people within it who don't care about stabilizing it. And even if you think that your guy is winning, you don't want a society in which, at least half and probably more than half of the people feel that they have no legal, peaceful recourse for changing the direction of the country. And that's just a neon red flag that we see going on around us right now that we must heal going forward.
Yeah, I agree completely with both of you, obviously, because you are brilliant at this. But I also think about the ways in which the voter suppression we've talked about interacts with something like gerrymandering, where you have people who believe that their votes don't really count and that they can't really choose their leaders, and they're correct about that. And then you put barriers in front of them to being able to vote, and the chance that they just simply choose not to jump through those hoops grows and grows and grows. And we get, increasing numbers of folks who feel like our government doesn't represent them. So a thing of mine is that I like to leave people with a thing they can do right now that will make a difference. And I'll go first. If you're interested in fighting gerrymandering with the Can't Win Victory Fund, check us out at can'twinvictoryfund.com. But more importantly, please go learn more about Justice Earls. And Justice Earls, you'll tell us what website to go to, right?
Yes, it's very simple. It's Earls for Justice, and you can use the number 4 or the word 4, all one word, earlsforjustice.com, and you'll learn more about my background and be able to join my effort. And while I totally agree about the influence of money in politics, I will also say that nobody should underestimate the power of grassroots donations and grassroots fundraising. So while it is so discouraging that billionaires can have the kind of influence that they do have because of the money they have, it's also encouraging that, $5, $10, $20 donations really, when you add them up, really can make a difference. And then don't underestimate your power as an influencer, right? Mm-hmm. So when you learn about what's going on in any particular election contest, sharing that information, like with your friends, with your family, with your networks, however you communicate with folks, you can really get a lot more people involved. So that's something I feel like you can do right now. There is always an election coming up. Wherever you live in this country, somebody's voting on something this year and next year. And so being engaged and informed and sharing that is just so valuable.
And state Supreme Courts are hugely important elections. We have seen that across the country. Even in Wisconsin in March, I think it was, when, if you remember, billionaire Elon Musk said that the fate of Western civilization hung on that particular election, because what hung on that election was whether or not Wisconsin would be gerrymandered dramatically in favor of the Republicans, or whether there would be fair maps. And in fact, it looks like Musk hurt the candidate he was backing, and we got somebody into that position who is going to back fair maps, we expect. And that's really what we're looking for. So I'm going to add to what the Justice and Kate have said, and that is, let people know that they need to check their registration, make sure you are registered, make sure your friends are registered, make sure they have the right papers that they need to have in order to be able to vote. Make sure people know that this is an issue, and make sure that in your own states and in other states as well, you're fighting for the right to vote and the right to have your vote matter. So we were going to fight against gerrymandering on that as well. And again, this is not about partisanship. It does mean that sometimes you're going to lose. But it does mean that if we preserve a system that has at least 2 viable parties, we will create stability in the system, and we will have a government that more accurately reflects what the people actually want, which right now we don't. So this is, it sounds like kind of a little way, sort of, when in my mind I'm seeing little mice right now, mm-hmm. trying to affect, the elephant. But the truth is, this is a place where the mice have all the power. We just have to use it. And on that note, I don't think I have more to add on that. Kate, do you want to take us out, or do you want me to?
You are welcome to. I'll just say thank you to you both, and thank you to everybody that joined in to listen.
And thank you, Justice, for being here as well.
This is a great opportunity, and so I really appreciate it.
It's cool to actually meet the people who are doing this. I mean, one of the things that frustrates me a little bit about being involved in my side of things is that often people don't know who their state justices are or who their representatives are. And the truth is, we're all just people trying to do the best thing we can. And it's really lovely that you were willing to come speak to us today and take some time to talk about the really big picture and how your role fits into that. So thank you for doing that. And thank you all for being here. This is our first, well, maybe not our first salvo in trying to repair our democracy, but it's one of the important ones. So thanks for coming along today, listening to this, thinking about voting and voting rights and what we as a group, as a community, can do to demand those rights for everybody the same way that they did in the 1960s and the 1930s and the 1920s and the 1890s and the 1870s and on back through our history, because we're part of a long tradition of people who believe in the Declaration of Independence and the right to have a say in our government. Thank you all for being here. Thank you too for being here, and I'll see you next time.